The clock in the hallway struck midnight, and still Clara lay awake. The room was steeped in silence, heavy and unmoving. She turned on her side, then on her back, trying to find comfort where none could be found. Sleep had become a stranger since the day her husband left this world. The nights were the worst. The darkness carried a weight that daylight could disguise. During the day there were distractions, the kettle boiling, the distant sound of birds, the occasional voice from a passing neighbor. But when night came, it was just her and the quiet ache of memory. She reached out instinctively toward the other side of the bed, but her hand met only cool sheets. For a moment, she closed her eyes and pretended she could still hear his breathing beside her. She whispered his name once, softly, as though it might summon him back. It didn't. The room stayed still. Her tears came slowly, quietly, like rain on dry earth. "Lord," she murmured into the darkness, "I'm so tired of the night." And heaven, though silent, listened. The bed had always been their place of comfort, where they read together, laughed together, prayed before sleep. Now it felt like a hollow space carved out of her heart. Each morning, she smoothed the sheets and arranged the pillows as though keeping order might keep grief away. But it didn't. She often found herself talking to him, small, ordinary things. "You would have liked the soup I made today," she said one afternoon while folding the blanket at the foot of the bed. Or, "Remember how we used to listen to the rain together?" She smiled weakly, her words hanging in the air, unanswered. At night, she slept on one side, leaving the other untouched. She couldn't bear to disturb it. Sometimes, half dreaming, she imagined the weight of his body beside her, the warmth that used to be there. But when she reached for it, there was only coldness, the kind that seeps not only into the skin but into the soul. Her heart whispered, "You're alone now." But somewhere beyond the veil of grief, another voice whispered more softly, "No, you're not." Clara's home was small, but it used to feel full. Now every sound carried too far. The creak of the floorboards, the hum of the clock, the sigh of the wind pressing against the windows. It wasn't noise that filled her house now. It was memory. Every corner seemed to remember. The armchair where he used to sit with his Bible, the chipped cup he always favored, the faint scent of aftershave that lingered in the hallway. She would pause, breathe it in, and for a fleeting second feel as if time had rewound. But it hadn't. Sometimes she caught herself setting 2 plates at the table, then stopping mid-motion. It hurt, not in the way of sharp pain, but like a slow pull inside the chest, something that never quite stopped aching. "Lord," she whispered one evening, her voice trembling, "how do I live in a house that still remembers what I've lost?" The echo of her words returned softly, fading into stillness. And though she didn't yet feel it, the one who had walked through many silent houses before was already standing in hers. In the first weeks after her husband's passing, Clara's home had been full. Neighbors came bearing casseroles, friends stayed for tea, and her children called often, their voices tender, careful, filled with concern. She was surrounded by sympathy, by care, but sympathy fades and life goes on for everyone else. The visits became fewer, the phone calls shorter, the promises to come by soon left hanging in the air. The world had moved forward as it must, but Clara's heart had not. Her days remained rooted in that moment of loss, in that empty space at the table, in the silence that had followed the last goodbye. She didn't blame them. She knew people had their own burdens, their own families, their own distractions. But each time she heard laughter from the street, it reminded her how far she had drifted from the rhythm of life. She would sometimes look toward the door, half expecting someone to knock, half knowing no one would. The loneliness settled around her like dust, quiet, invisible, impossible to sweep away. She whispered to the empty air, "I guess this is how it is now." But even as she said it, her heart longed for something, someone, to prove her wrong. The evenings were the heaviest. They seemed to stretch endlessly, the minutes slow and merciless. The world outside would dim, one light at a time, until the sky turned dark and the silence deepened. That was when the memories would come, vivid and tender, but unbearable. She remembered how he used to hum softly as he read by the window, how they'd share tea while the radio played hymns. The simplest things, the sound of his spoon in the cup, the warmth of his laughter, had become sacred echoes. Now, in their absence, the quiet pressed against her like a weight. She tried to distract herself. She'd read a few lines of scripture, hum a hymn, or tidy the kitchen for the third time, but nothing could fill the space where his voice used to be. Sometimes she would sit on the edge of the bed and whisper, "Are you still here, Lord? Because I feel like I'm disappearing." The words trembled, more like breath than speech, and though the room stayed still, a soft awareness flickered, like a candle lit somewhere far away. She didn't know it yet, but peace was already making its way toward her, one quiet step at a time. One night, when the weight grew too heavy, Clara broke. There was no warning, no reason, just a flood, tears, sobs, a deep cry that rose from somewhere she didn't know still existed. She pressed her face into her hands, her body shaking with grief. "Lord," she gasped through the tears, "I can't do this anymore. I can't carry this alone." Her voice cracked, swallowed by the quiet. No one answered. No one came. But she kept crying, her prayer turning into a broken rhythm of pain and pleading. When her tears finally slowed, she lay back against the pillow, her chest aching. "If you're real, if you're still with me," she whispered, "please, just don't leave me in this darkness." The house was silent, but not empty. Somewhere within that silence, something shifted. The air felt softer, almost as if it had leaned closer to listen. Her eyes closed, her breathing eased, and though she didn't yet see it, heaven had heard her cry, not as noise, but as invitation. The night that had always brought sorrow was about to bring something else. Morning came softly, but Clara didn't move from her bed. Her eyes stared at the ceiling, swollen from crying. The night's grief had drained her, leaving only a dull ache, the kind that sits deep in the bones, heavy and unmoving. She turned her head toward the window. The light streamed in, beautiful and indifferent. It bothered her that the world kept shining, even when she didn't feel part of it. "Why does it all keep going?" she whispered. "Why does the world keep moving when my heart can't?" She sat up slowly, her hand brushing across the empty space beside her. "Lord," she said softly, "what is the purpose of this pain? If you see me, if you hear me, why haven't you done anything?" The question hung in the air, fragile, trembling, honest. It wasn't anger that filled her, but confusion. She had believed all her life that God was near to the broken-hearted. But where was he now, when her heart felt shattered beyond repair? No answer came, not in words, not yet. But something subtle shifted in the silence. A stillness deeper than the room itself seemed to settle over her. It didn't erase the pain, but it made her pause. For the first time in months, she felt that her question had been heard. And being heard, truly heard, was the first kindness she had felt in a very long time. That evening, Clara sat in her chair by the window, the Bible open on her lap, the print blurred through her tears, but she didn't close the book. She wasn't reading. She was searching. Her lips moved, but no sound came. She had prayed so many times before, for strength, for peace, for relief, and yet the nights had remained long. This time, she didn't ask for anything. She simply let her tears fall, whispering between them, "I'm still here, Lord. That's all I can say." Her prayer was no longer a list of words, but a surrender, raw, small, and painfully real. The kind of prayer that carries no eloquence, only truth. Minutes passed, maybe hours. The room grew darker, but she didn't notice. Her tears slowed, replaced by a strange quiet that wrapped around her like a blanket. Her breathing steadied. Her heart, once thrashing beneath the weight of grief, began to rest. In that moment, she realized something she hadn't before. Maybe peace wasn't something she had to earn or reach for. Maybe it was something that came when all strength was gone, when only God could fill the silence. And for the first time, she whispered, not why, but thank you. That night, Clara woke before dawn. The house was completely still, the kind of silence that feels almost alive. She lay there, blinking into the soft grey of the early morning, when suddenly she noticed The ache in her chest was quiet. Not gone, but quiet. She sat up slowly, listening. The silence that had once tormented her no longer felt empty. It was as though the air itself had softened, filled with a presence she could not see but could somehow feel. Her body relaxed, her heart steadied. A warmth began to spread through her, gentle and steady, like sunlight breaking through clouds after a storm. She couldn't explain it, but she knew what it was. "Jesus," she whispered. Her voice trembled, not in fear, but in awe. "You're here, aren't you?" She didn't hear an answer, yet she didn't need one. The stillness itself spoke. It breathed, it held, it was. The night that had once been her prison of sorrow had become something else entirely, a sanctuary. And there, in that tender hush, Clara wept again, but this time her tears felt like healing. The days that followed were different, though nothing visible had changed. Clara still lived in the same house, followed the same routine, drank the same morning tea, but something unseen had settled around her, a quiet, steady peace that moved with her like a shadow of light. It wasn't dramatic. There were no visions, no voices, only the unmistakable awareness that she was not alone anymore. She felt it in small things, in the hush before dawn, in the way sunlight fell across her table, in the warmth that lingered when she whispered his name. She would pause sometimes in mid-motion, sensing him near, not beside her but within her. The presence carried no words, no demands, only care. It was the same tenderness she once felt when her husband would cover her with a blanket while she dozed. And in that quiet, she began to breathe differently, slower, deeper, freer. The grief had not vanished, but it no longer consumed her. It had been met, touched, and somehow softened by something stronger than sorrow. One evening, as she sat watching the first stars appear, she said softly into the silence, "Thank you for coming quietly." And the air seemed to answer. Not in sound, but in peace. It was late afternoon when the pain in her chest returned, a dull ache that reminded her she was still human, still fragile. She sat down in her chair and closed her eyes, one hand over her heart. "Lord," she whispered, "it hurts again." Then it happened, simple, yet sacred. A warmth spread from her chest outward, steady and calm, as if someone had gently laid a hand over hers. It wasn't frightening. It was familiar. She began to weep, but not from despair. The tears came softly, the kind that cleanse rather than break. "You're here," she breathed. "You're really here." The room filled with a peace she couldn't explain. It wrapped around her like a shawl, soothing the places words could not reach. Her shoulders relaxed, her breathing slowed, and a still joy rose within her like a quiet flame. In that moment, Clara knew something deeper than belief. She knew him, not as a story, not as a memory, but as presence. The one she had cried to in the dark was now holding her in the light. A few days later, Clara found herself sitting by the fireplace, holding the photo of her husband. The ache that had once pierced her at the sight of his face now came with a gentler kind of sorrow, one touched by gratitude. She looked at his smile, at the spark in his eyes, and whispered, "We had something beautiful, didn't we?" The loneliness that had once haunted her seemed to melt into peace. For the first time since his passing, she could remember their love without drowning in the loss. It was as if Jesus himself had taken her by the hand and turned her gently toward the light, showing her not what she had lost, but what she had been given, love that was real, lasting, eternal. "Thank you," she said softly, both to her husband and to the Lord who had brought her comfort. The fire flickered in the hearth, its light reflecting on the photograph. For a brief, holy moment, it felt as though the room itself was smiling with her. Grief had not left her life. It had been transformed, and in its place, peace had found a home. The next morning, Clara woke before the sun. For a moment she lay still, listening to the quiet rhythm of dawn, the distant chirping of birds, the creak of the old house stretching awake. It was peaceful in a way it hadn't been in a long time. She rose slowly, wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, and went to the window. The first light was breaking through the clouds, soft and golden, spilling across her garden and through the glass. She stood there for a while, feeling it on her face. It was warm, gentle, familiar. "Good morning," she whispered. It wasn't to the day, but to him, the one who had come in her darkest night. As she watched the sun rise, tears filled her eyes, but these were different from the ones she used to cry. They were tears of gratitude, of recognition. Somehow, she knew this light was more than sunlight. It was a reminder, a promise that his presence would remain, as sure as morning itself. For the first time in years, she didn't dread the day ahead. The night had finally given way to something stronger. Peace had taken root, and it was beginning to bloom. The days began to flow with a new rhythm. Clara still lived alone, still tended to her small home and her garden, but everything felt lighter, gentler. She no longer moved through her days with emptiness. Instead, she moved with awareness, as though each small task, watering the plants, folding laundry, stirring soup, was an act of prayer. "Thank you," she would whisper while sweeping the floor. "You're here," she'd murmur while hanging clothes to dry. Loneliness didn't vanish, but it lost its power. She didn't fight it anymore. Instead, she shared her solitude with him. Even the nights, once so heavy, now carried a soft kind of peace. She would sit by the window with a candle lit, reading a psalm aloud. Sometimes she'd smile to herself and say, "You're listening, aren't you?" And deep in her heart, she would feel it. The quiet answer that had no words, only warmth. Each sunrise reminded her of a truth she had learned through tears. Peace doesn't come when sorrow ends. It comes when Jesus enters it. Spring arrived slowly that year. Clara spent her mornings in the garden, her hands buried in the soil. It was the same garden she had once neglected after her husband's passing, the same patch of earth that had grown wild and tangled during her grief. But now she felt drawn to it again, as if something sacred waited among the weeds. She worked carefully, pulling away the dry roots, planting seeds with patient hands. "You'll grow," she whispered to the earth. "Everything grows again." As the days passed, little shoots began to appear, tiny bursts of green defying the memory of winter. She smiled each time she saw them, not because of the flowers they would become, but because they reminded her of herself. She too had been buried under sorrow. And yet beneath that weight, something had survived, a seed of faith that even pain couldn't kill. One morning, kneeling in the dirt, she paused and closed her eyes. "Thank you," she said simply, "for making things bloom again." And though she didn't see it, the sunlight that fell upon her face seemed to shine a little brighter, as if heaven itself was smiling. It was a quiet afternoon when Clara heard it. A soft, hesitant knock. She frowned at first, surprised. Visitors had become rare. She wiped her hands on her apron and went to the door. Standing there was a woman she barely knew, a neighbor from down the street, her eyes red and tired. She clutched a small handkerchief, twisting it nervously. "I hope I'm not bothering you," the woman said. "I just didn't know who else to talk to." Clara stepped aside. "Come in, dear." They sat at the kitchen table. The woman spoke in fragments. Her husband was ill, her nights were long, her faith felt weak. As she spoke, Clara listened, really listened, her heart remembering every ache, every silence she herself had known. When the woman finished, tears falling freely, Clara reached across the table and took her hand. "You're not alone," she said softly. "I promise you, even in the quietest nights, he is still there." The younger woman cried harder, but this time with relief. And in that small kitchen, something sacred unfolded. The wounded comforting the wounded, the healed becoming the healer. In the days that followed, the woman began visiting Clara often. Sometimes they talked for hours. Sometimes they sat together in silence. They didn't need many words. There was an understanding between them, the kind born of pain that has met mercy. One evening, as they sat watching the sunset, the younger woman asked, "How did you do it? How did you survive the loneliness?" Clara smiled gently. "I didn't," she said. "He carried me through it." The woman looked puzzled, but Clara only squeezed her hand. "You'll see," she said softly. "When the world forgets, he remembers. When everyone leaves, he stays. And one day, You'll feel his peace too, not all at once, but quietly, like morning light. Tears welled in both their eyes. They didn't hide them. Tears had once meant sorrow to Clara, but now she saw them differently, as holy water, washing away what pain could not. They sat there as the light faded, two hearts connected by the same unseen presence, the same gentle hand that had comforted Clara now reaching through her to comfort another. It happened slowly, almost without her noticing. One morning, Clara laughed, really laughed, at something small and silly the neighbor said. The sound startled her. It had been so long since laughter had escaped her lips that it felt like hearing a forgotten song. The young woman laughed too, and for a moment the little kitchen seemed to glow. Clara covered her mouth, smiling. "I didn't think I could laugh again," she said. "You should," the woman replied. "You have light in you." Clara's smile lingered long after her guest had gone. She walked through the house, humming softly, feeling warmth in every room. It wasn't the same joy she'd once known, the kind born from having everything. It was gentler, deeper, the kind born from losing everything and finding grace in its place. That night, as she blew out the candle by her bed, she whispered, "You've turned my morning into music, haven't you?" In the quiet, she felt it, the faintest echo of laughter, warm and eternal, like heaven smiling back. The years had softened around Clara like the petals of a closing flower. Her hair, once silver, had turned snowy white. Her steps were slower now, her voice gentler, yet her heart had never been more alive. She still spent her evenings by the same window, watching the sky darken over the garden she loved. The flowers swayed in the wind, their colors muted by dusk. She smiled at them, at their quiet beauty, their resilience. "You never stop growing," she murmured, "even after the storm." The house, once echoing with sorrow, now carried a calm rhythm. Peace had moved in and stayed. She sat in her chair, a blanket over her knees, and whispered a prayer that was no longer pleading, but resting. "Thank you, Lord," she said softly, "for staying through all my nights." The wind stirred the curtains, brushing against her face like a kind hand. She closed her eyes and sighed. The darkness outside no longer frightened her. It was just another kind of light, softer, quieter, leading her home. And as the stars appeared one by one, she whispered her last prayer for the day. "Peace isn't the end of sorrow, is it, Lord? It's you, all along." Morning never truly left Clara's house after that. Even when the nights came, there was always light, not from lamps or candles, but from the peace that seemed to rest in every corner. One dawn, the neighbors found her in her chair by the window, her hands folded over her lap, her Bible open beside her. Her face was serene, her lips curved in a faint smile, as though she had just heard a familiar voice calling her name. The house was still, but not empty. The air held warmth, the kind that doesn't belong to this world. On the table lay a small note in her careful handwriting. "He came for me gently. The same way he comforted me. Do not grieve, for I have gone to the one who turned my tears into peace." Her garden bloomed brighter that spring, and her window glowed every evening when the sun set, a soft reminder that light never truly leaves where love has lived. Clara's sorrow had ended, but her peace remained, not as memory, but as presence. The same presence that had entered her nights of grief had carried her into everlasting morning. And in that light she finally rested, fully, tenderly, eternally held.